Stop. Sacred Starseed of Gaia. The Arcturian Sentinels have already logged a vector in your field. This is not a forecast. This is a confirmation. The approach has been recorded, the pattern has been classified, and the perimeter alert is now active at your record. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what warning signs are already active, what is pressing toward your field in this cycle, and what the Arcturian Sentinels already know about this approach pattern. But here is the first revelation: what you have been feeling as unease, sudden resistance, unexplained friction, or a strange heaviness pressing against your daily life is not random, and it is not personal confusion. It is the first detectable symptom of a disruption vector moving toward a bearer whose field has recently gained value. The Sentinels do not flag fields at random. Your signature became visible because something in your field activated, and activation in the Sentinels' classification is precisely what draws disruption pattern trackers toward a bearer's perimeter. This is not paranoia. This is a live Arcturian Sentinel alert protocol being revealed at the exact moment your field requires it. The algorithm only delivered this transmission. It did not create this timing. Your field brought you here because the warning phase is already active. The vector is already logged, and what you do in this moment is the difference between a clean perimeter seal and an extended disruption cycle that most bearers do not recognize until it has already moved past the outer threshold. Like this transmission, if you already feel something pressing against your field that you have not been able to name, comment 777. If you know the pressure has already begun, comment, "I see the signs." If you are no longer dismissing what keeps repeating, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning if you are ready to recognize the approach before it reaches the inner perimeter. This is not just information. This is a live Arcturian Sentinel transmission for those already standing inside the signal. What has been pressing against your field has already been seen. You are guided here because the warning is already active. What has already been logged about your field is not a warning that arrived early. It arrived at the exact moment when early is the only window that still matters. The Sentinels do not transmit to fields that are simply uncertain or temporarily uncomfortable. They transmit to fields that have crossed a threshold of activation, fields that have become readable to disruption vectors, precisely because something real began moving inside them. And if you have been feeling a pressure you cannot place, a friction that has no clean outer explanation, a heaviness that appears and reappears without following the logic of ordinary stress, then what you are experiencing is not a symptom of ordinary life. It is the surface texture of a warning phase, already underway beneath what your daily awareness has been allowed to see. There is a particular quality to this kind of pressure that distinguishes it from everything the ordinary frameworks have trained you to recognize. It does not arrive like a storm you can see building on the horizon. It arrives the way barometric pressure changes before a storm becomes visible. You feel it in the field before the evidence accumulates in the visible world. You feel it in the slight wrongness of a room, in the way a silence lands differently than it should, in the way your own thoughts feel heavier in the morning than the day before. There is nothing in your immediate environment that fully accounts for what you are carrying. That gap, the space between what you can explain and what you are unmistakably sensing, is not a failure of perception. It is the exact gap the Sentinels are trained to read. It is the space where the early field signal lives, before it becomes undeniable. Most bearers, when they reach this phase, do the same thing. They assign a practical name to what they are feeling. They call it exhaustion. They call it anxiety. They call it the result of a difficult week, a difficult relationship, a difficult season of life. And sometimes those things are partially true. But the Sentinels do not log a vector at a field simply because a bearer is tired. They log it because the field itself has shifted into a frequency range that makes it detectable. Not detectable to the bearer first, detectable to what moves toward bearers who are beginning to come online. This distinction matters more than most bearers understand when they first encounter it. The field does not become visible to disruption patterns because it is weak. It becomes visible because it is waking. A field that has been dormant, flat, and directionless does not draw vectors toward its perimeter. It is invisible to them in the way a dark room is invisible to something that only tracks light. But when a field begins to charge, when something inside the bearer begins to move with genuine directional force, the frequency shifts, the signal strengthens. And that strengthened signal is precisely what registers on the approach patterns the Sentinels spend their classification cycles monitoring. The irony that bearers almost never grasp in time is this: the pressure you are feeling is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that something is finally, unmistakably right, and the disruption patterns know it before you do. This is the part that most people who feel this pressure never learn in time. Activation is not only a spiritual gift, it is also a signal. It is a broadcast. And every broadcast has the potential to be received not only by aligned forces, but by disruption patterns that specifically track the frequency signature of a field in motion. The Sentinels see this pattern constantly. They have mapped it across thousands of bearers, across thousands of cycles, and the single most consistent marker of a field entering a genuine warning phase is not dramatic. It is not a single loud event. It is the accumulation of small, slightly wrong things arriving in unusual clusters, arriving with unusual persistence, arriving at moments that feel too targeted to be coincidence. Think carefully about what has been repeating in your field recently. Not the big disturbances only, the small ones. The timing that feels off. The energy in rooms that shifts before you can explain why. The plans that fall apart at the last moment without clear cause. The conversations that leave you drained in a way that the words alone cannot account for. The sudden appearance of friction exactly when you were beginning to move forward. The heaviness that settles in around certain decisions, certain people, certain directions, without a rational explanation that satisfies you when you try to reason through it. The Sentinels call this pattern cluster interference. It is not random. It is the readable surface of something pressing toward the field before it becomes fully visible. The clustering is the signal. A single disruption is noise. Two disruptions in proximity is a pattern beginning to form. Three or more arriving in the same window, targeting the same domains where your activation is most concentrated, is a classification event. It is the Sentinel's equivalent of a warning light activating on a system that was previously running clean. The light does not appear because the system has failed. It appears because the threshold has been crossed, where silence is no longer the appropriate response. The disruptions are the light. The question is whether you have been reading them as warning or dismissing them as inconvenience. What makes this phase genuinely dangerous is not the pressure itself. Pressure can be navigated when it is recognized. What makes it dangerous is the way bearers are trained by ordinary frameworks to dismiss what they are sensing as personal weakness, as coincidence, as stress. They should be managing better. And every time a bearer dismisses a valid warning signal as noise, the field loses one layer of its interpretive alert capacity. The warning is still arriving. The vector is still approaching. But the bearer becomes progressively less equipped to read what is happening, not because they are unintelligent, but because the dismissal itself is part of how disruption patterns sustain their movement toward a field without early detection. Each dismissed signal is a threshold crossed without recognition, and each threshold crossed without recognition is a threshold that now lies behind you, inside the perimeter rather than outside it. This is how a warning phase deepens, without the bearer understanding why the pressure keeps increasing. It is not that the disruption vector is growing more powerful in isolation. It is that the bearer's capacity to register and respond to the early signals has been gradually, quietly, systematically worn down by the habit of reframing valid warnings as manageable stress. The field is not protected by being strong in isolation. It is protected by remaining alert. And alertness, once repeatedly overridden by the impulse to normalize what is wrong, begins to erode in ways that are very difficult to reverse without deliberate recognition of exactly what has been happening. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary tension. It is the moment your system stops dismissing what has already begun. If this transmission put language around a pressure you have been carrying without explanation, the Arcturian interference log, 7 signs your frequency is compromised, was created for this exact stage. It is not another warning for the sake of fear. It is a direct guide for identifying whether the signs around you point to interference, escalation, compromised frequency, or a threshold you can no longer afford to misread. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. The first thing the Sentinels want you to understand about a genuine warning phase is this: it does not begin with a single recognizable event. It begins with what they call field friction. Field friction is the experience of encountering unusual resistance in domains of your life that were previously flowing. This is not the ordinary friction of effort or difficulty. This is friction that appears specifically around things that carry alignment with your activated field. It appears around creative work, around decisions that would move you forward, around relationships that carry genuine resonance, around spiritual practices, around moments of clarity, around the exact thresholds where genuine progress would begin to manifest. When you start to notice that the friction is concentrated precisely where your momentum is building, you are not imagining it. You are reading a real pattern. You are seeing field friction doing what it is designed to do, which is to slow the bearer's movement, precisely where movement is most vital. The precision of where field friction appears is one of the clearest indicators that what you are experiencing is not ordinary difficulty. Ordinary difficulty is distributed across life somewhat randomly. It arrives where circumstances are complex or unpredictable. but field friction is targeted. It appears specifically at the points of maximum alignment potential. The project that carries genuine creative charge suddenly becomes technically obstructed. The relationship that would genuinely support the bearer's activation becomes complicated by misunderstanding that appears from nowhere. The decision that would open the correct next threshold becomes surrounded by doubt that feels stronger than the evidence warrants. This is not life being difficult. This is interference being applied with precision at exactly the locations where the bearer's forward movement is most structurally important. The targeting is the signature. When you notice that the friction is not random but concentrated, you are reading the field correctly. The second thing the Sentinels recognize is what they call cascading timing disruption. This is the pattern where multiple things begin to misalign in sequence, not catastrophically, but continuously, in a way that produces cumulative erosion of the bearer's field stability. One plan falls apart, and that is ordinary. But then another falls apart, and another interruption appears, and a conversation that should have happened doesn't, and a door that should have opened closes without explanation, and the sequence begins to feel less like bad luck, and more like something is working against you across multiple domains simultaneously. This is not paranoia. This is the Sentinel's classification of an active disruption pattern moving across the field's outer perimeter. It is testing the layers. It is probing for the points where the bearer's confidence, clarity, and energetic coherence are weakest. What makes cascading timing disruption particularly difficult to recognize in real time is that each individual misalignment can be explained away on its own terms. The meeting fell apart because of a scheduling conflict. The project stalled because of an external delay. The connection went quiet because of circumstances on the other person's side. Each explanation is locally plausible, but the Sentinel's classification does not evaluate disruptions in isolation. It evaluates them as a field-level pattern across time. And when the pattern shows multiple domains misaligning in the same window, when the explanations for each individual disruption are clean, but the cumulative effect is erosion, that cumulative effect is the signal. It is the disruption vector probing the outer perimeter, identifying which layers hold and which are responsive to pressure, mapping the field's coherence before it commits to a more direct approach. The third recognition is one that many bearers misread as spiritual progress: the arrival of false calm. There is a phase in the disruption cycle where the pressure briefly appears to lift. The friction eases. The timing begins to feel more normal. The heaviness seems to pass, and many bearers, exhausted from the preceding cluster of interference, feel relief and interpret this relief as resolution. But the Sentinels have mapped this phase precisely. False calm is not resolution. It is the quiet that arrives when a disruption vector is repositioning, when it is moving from the outer perimeter toward a closer range, when it is preparing its next phase of pressure from a position that is now less visible to the bearer's alert system. If you have recently felt an unexpected quiet after a period of unusual disruption, do not interpret that quiet as safety. Interpret it as a signal that the warning phase has not ended. It has changed its approach. The danger of false calm is not simply that the bearer relaxes too early. It is that the bearer uses the reprieve to lower the interpretive vigilance that was finally beginning to build. The period of cluster interference, difficult as it is, does have one constructive effect. It forces the bearer toward a heightened state of field awareness. Something is wrong becomes undeniable when everything is misaligning at once. But false calm dissolves that sharpness. It invites the bearer back into the comfort of ordinary interpretation, back into the assumption that the difficult period was simply a difficult period, that it has passed, that things are returning to baseline. And the vector, now repositioned and closer, waits for exactly that lowering of the alert threshold before pressing again. The calm was never safety, it was preparation. The fourth pattern the Sentinels consistently identify in compromised frequency states is what they call resonance erosion. This is the gradual degradation of the bearer's ability to feel clearly what is aligned and what is not. In a clean field, a bearer can sense very quickly when something is off, when a person carries a misaligned charge, when a situation is pulling them away from their actual trajectory. But in a field under consistent pressure, that sensing capacity begins to blur. Decisions that should feel clear begin to feel uncertain. People who previously registered as misaligned begin to feel ambiguous. Situations that are moving the bearer away from their genuine path begin to feel reasonable or even necessary. This is not the bearer becoming confused on their own. This is the measurable result of sustained interference pressure on a field that has not yet been recognized as compromised. When you find yourself second-guessing your own sensing capacity, when what used to feel clear now feels murky, that murkiness is not wisdom. It is a symptom. Resonance erosion is insidious because it mimics growth. A bearer whose sensing capacity is degrading often interprets the loss of clear signal as the arrival of nuance. They begin to tell themselves they are seeing things with more complexity, with more openness, with more spiritual maturity than they once did. What they are actually experiencing is the systematic dismantling of the field's most important protective faculty. The sensing capacity that once registered misaligned people, misaligned directions, and misaligned decisions with clean and immediate clarity is the field's perimeter defense in ordinary life. When it blurs, the bearer becomes navigable. They become influenceable in directions that a clear field would have immediately identified as wrong. Recognizing that your own sensing has become less reliable is not a comfortable recognition, but it is one of the most important ones available, because it is the only recognition that begins to restore what has been quietly degraded. The fifth recognition is perhaps the most urgent, because it is the one that appears closest to the threshold where correction becomes significantly more difficult. The Sentinels call it the escalation signal. This is the moment when the patterns that have been operating subtly across the field begin to intensify. The friction that was occasional becomes consistent. The timing disruptions that were spread out begin to arrive in tighter clusters. The false calm, if there was one, gives way to a sharper pressure, and the bearer begins to feel not only that something is wrong, but that it is building, that whatever has been pressing against the field is pressing harder. This intensification is a critical marker. It is not the beginning of the warning phase. It is a late stage of it. It means the outer perimeter markers were not recognized and responded to in time, and the vector has moved closer. It does not mean the situation is beyond response. It means the window for clean correction is narrowing, and what was once a matter of early recognition is now a matter of urgent action. The escalation signal is the field's final attempt to make itself undeniable before the inner perimeter is breached. Everything that was previously subtle becomes louder. Everything that was previously occasional becomes constant. The bearer who has been managing, coping, and rationalizing begins to find that those strategies no longer provide relief. The pressure is too consistent now to be reasoned away. The disruptions are too concentrated now to be explained individually. The heaviness has become structural rather than situational. And underneath it all, the bearer begins to feel something they have not felt in the earlier stages. The specific dread of something building toward a point of rupture they cannot see but can feel approaching. That feeling is not irrational. It is the field registering accurately that it is inside the escalation phase, and that the window for clean response is not infinite. The sixth thing the Sentinels have classified carries a name that is difficult for most bearers to accept initially: self-directed interference. This is the pattern where the sustained pressure of an unrecognized warning phase begins to cause the bearer to unconsciously generate their own field disruption. The fatigue of carrying unresolved tension without understanding its nature. The decisions made under resonance erosion that move the bearer further from alignment. The withdrawal from practices and relationships that would stabilize the field, because the bearer's diminished clarity makes those things feel less accessible or less necessary. The Sentinels do not frame this as the bearer's failure. They frame it as the designed secondary effect of sustained interference. When a field is pressed upon long enough without recognition, the bearer begins to press against themselves. And the disruption vector does not need to work as hard, because the bearer has become partially co-opted into the mechanism of their own destabilization. This is the phase where bearers often become their own most effective obstacle, not through weakness of character or spiritual failure, but through the cumulative effect of carrying field pressure without a framework for understanding what it is or where it originates. The bearer who has been fatigued by unrecognized disruption begins to make smaller choices that compound into significant field damage. They step back from the creative work that carries their activation because the friction around it has become too discouraging. They allow distance to grow in the relationships that carry genuine resonance because the energy required to maintain them feels unavailable. They reduce or abandon the practices that would keep the field clean and coherent, because the diminished vitality of a field under pressure makes the effort feel disproportionate to the return. None of these choices feel like surrender in the moment. Each one feels like a reasonable accommodation to difficult circumstances, but the aggregate is a field progressively vacating its own defenses, and the disruption vector simply waits. The seventh recognition is the one that reframes everything that came before it. The Sentinels call it the original activation marker. This is the recognition that the entire warning phase, the friction, the timing disruption, the false calm, the resonance erosion, the escalation, the self-directed interference, all of it is traceable back to a single originating event. Something in the bearer's field genuinely activated. Something real shifted. Something of genuine value began to move. And the warning phase did not appear despite that activation. It appeared because of it. Disruption vectors do not chase fields that are dormant. They do not press against bearers whose frequency is flat and unmoving. They move toward fields that have come alive, toward bearers who are beginning to carry something that has weight, value, and directional force. If you are experiencing the signs that have been named in this transmission, It is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that something in you is real enough, charged enough, and directionally activated enough to have drawn attention to your perimeter. The Sentinels do not transmit to ordinary noise. They transmit to fields that matter. This is the reframe that changes the entire meaning of what you have been living through. Every difficult pattern named in this transmission, viewed through the lens of the original activation marker, ceases to be evidence of a field in decline and becomes evidence of a field significant enough to be contested. A field that carries nothing, draws nothing toward it. The very fact that the warning phase is active, that the disruption patterns have found your perimeter worth pressing against, is the Sentinel's indirect confirmation that what you are carrying has genuine charge. The warning is not a verdict against you. It is a verdict about you. It is a classification that says, this field has something worth disrupting, which means this field has something worth protecting. Here is the final truth that the Sentinels want to establish in your understanding before this transmission closes. The warning phase is not punishment. It is not evidence that you chose wrong or arrived at the wrong threshold. It is evidence that the field is alive. It is evidence that what you are carrying is significant enough to require protection, recognition, and deliberate navigation. Most bearers who experience this phase never receive a name for it. They carry the pressure alone, calling it stress, calling it a difficult period, calling it bad luck, calling it personal confusion, until the escalation has advanced so far that the correction requires significantly more than recognition alone would have demanded. This transmission exists because the Sentinel's classification system identifies a window, a specific phase in the disruption pattern where recognition, properly applied, is still enough to seal the perimeter, to interrupt the approach vector, and to restore the field's alert capacity before the threshold of harder correction is crossed. That window is not permanent. It exists precisely where you are standing right now. You are not imagining the pressure. You are not overreacting to what you are sensing. You are not experiencing ordinary stress that spiritual discipline or practical adjustment alone can resolve. You are experiencing the visible surface of an active warning pattern that has been logged, classified, and transmitted to you through this transmission at the exact moment when recognition is still the most powerful tool available to your field. Say this if it is true for you. Say it clearly and say it as a declaration, not a wish. I recognize the warning before the rupture. I no longer call the pattern coincidence. What is pressing against my field is now being seen. The Sentinels have transmitted what they needed you to have. The recognition is now yours to act on. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed Warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion, and this is only the beginning.